Think we have enough people in that I should start, or should we wait a few more minutes?
All right.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I am Maggie Fleming. Welcome to our GrowSmart Maine forum, More Broadband, Less Sprawl. I am a member of the GrowSmart Maine board, and I'm also our events committee chair. So to tell you a little bit more about GrowSmart Maine, our mission is to build lasting prosperity without sacrificing the quality of life that defines Maine. And we do this through raising awareness and support of smart growth principles, facilitating conversations amongst diverse voices, and through advocacy. So the pandemic over the last year has definitely showed us that there's a vital need for broadband and broadband expansion. And broadband's especially important for, as we've seen over the last year, for work, for school, and for telehealth appointments, and even more recently for signing up for vaccine appointments. And broadband expansion is a federal and a state priority. And right now is a really important time to be having this conversation because there's significant federal funding that's about to come to Maine for broadband, somewhere between 100 million and 120 million through the new American Rescue Plan that was just signed. And this money comes on top of already existing federal and state funding through several sources, including Connect Maine, the USDA, the FCC, and CARES Act funding. And it's really important too to think about how these funding sources could be stacked to really get the most bang for our buck. So some desired outcomes we have for this webinar. So GrowSmart Maine believes that affordable high-speed internet access is vital to lasting prosperity. But as we improve this access, we must consider the possibility that expanding broadband could lead to sprawl, which can have negative impacts on fiscal implications for municipalities, climate implications, and negative impacts on quality of life. And so it's important through this webinar that we build connections between planners, community volunteers, and also create awareness about resources around broadband expansion, such as the Maine Broadband Coalition and Connect Maine. We also want to create through this webinar a better understanding of smart growth tools the municipalities could use to encourage equitable, sustainable growth, while also accommodating broadband expansion. And we would like to thank Bangor Savings for supporting our work on this subject. And now I'd like to introduce our three amazing distinguished speakers. We have Judy East, who is Executive Director of the Maine Land Use Planning Commission, which is the planning and zoning authority for the unorganized and deorganized areas of the state. Judy has 33 years of experience working across disciplines at the local, regional, and state levels in New York and New England, with the last 21 years being in rural Maine. And her services including community development, climate vulnerability assessment and resilience planning, transportation and infrastructure, planning and development, including cellular and broadband infrastructure planning, and multiple issues in land use planning and local regulation. And Judy lives in Calais. And then we have Kendra Grindle, who's a Senior Community Development Officer and the Broadband Lead at the Island Institute, which is a nonprofit organization in Rockland. And prior to her time in broadband, Kendra worked for 3 years supporting Maine-based groundfish fishermen at the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association. And she came to Maine back in 2013 as an Island Institute Fellow in the community of Islesboro. And she comes from West Virginia, but currently lives in Union. And last but not least, we have Peggy Schaefer, who's the Executive Director of Connect Maine, of the Connect Maine Authority, which is Maine's program to expand broadband to underserved areas of the state. And prior to joining Connect Maine, Peggy was the small business advocate in the Secretary of State's office and also served as co-chair for the Maine Broadband Coalition, which is a statewide advocacy organization that is focused on expanding high-speed broadband. And Peggy has served as the Chief of Staff in the State Senate and as Legislative Liaison for the Department of Economic and Community Development under both the King and Baldacci administrations. And Peggy lives in Vassalboro. So to tell you a little bit about the schedule for today, we're going to start with having a conversation amongst the four of us for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And while we're speaking, the chat will be open for you to share your thoughts and ideas. And then the Q&A will also be open for you to provide questions for the panelists to answer later in the program. And then you'll also see, we'll be dropping in the chat some different polls you can take and different resources as we're having a conversation as well. Okay, so I'd like to start by giving our panelists an opportunity to tell us about themselves and what their connection to this topic is. And we're going to start with Peggy.
Hi, good afternoon. I am the director of the Connect Maine Authority. I started this job in April 1st, 2019. Connect Maine has been around since about 2006. It was created as the state authority to fund broadband expansion. Broadband has been, or connectivity around broadband has been a priority for the state for quite some time. I mean, under Governor King, we started the Maine School Library Network, which is really one of the premier networks in the state that brings now gig service to most schools and libraries across the state. And Connect Maine was is funded by a small fee on mostly landline service that provides us a little over $1 million, about $1.5 million a year to expand broadband. And we've been chugging along at that since 2006 with small amounts of grants, really to be doing some extensive or not so extensive, what I call provider expansion projects. People want to grow their footprint, want to improve the quality of service to their footprint, to their telco footprint. And then in 2015, the legislature added a new charge, which was community planning. And they did this for a couple of reasons. One is that we saw there across the state, there's just not a lot of community engagement in this conversation. So we were getting a lot of comments from people who were like, I want to get connected, but we didn't really have a way for communities to engage with each other to really begin to plan and think about how to do this work. So the legislature gave Connect Me the authority to do community planning grants, which we put in place in 2016. Right now, I think we have about 160 communities that have participated through our process, probably more if you include the ones who've gone through the Island Institute and some of the programs that like the Maine Community Foundation has, and also communities who have undertaken this on their own. And to me, the important piece about the community planning is it sort of gives the community an idea of what they want to do with this, why they can have a conversation about why broadband is important to their community and what kind of service they want their community to have and for what reason. And that gives what I refer to as like sticky tape for a provider to come in and figure out, oh, there's enough interest in this community that I can maybe with a grant and maybe some support from the community, make an investment here and get a return on my investment and actually pay for the service. So that I think it's been an important piece on that. We haven't seen a lot of communities move from the planning process to a build, mostly because we haven't had the money to move them to a build, right? When we're spending $500,000 to $700,000 a year to expand broadband service, you're not expanding a lot. We think there's about 85,000 people in the state at a minimum who do not have adequate broadband. And adequate is defined by the FCC standard of 25 down and 3 up, which is an inadequate standard. And so it's important that as we begin to think about this, we think about how communities really can engage in this. For us, a big piece of this is, for me anyways, a big piece of this is a question about equity, right? Broadband gives you access to the key economic element of the 21st century, which is communication, right? That's how we do everything. It's how we get access to education, how you get access to employment, national markets and international markets if you're a small business, a whole variety of things. And so a lot of what needs to drive our conversation around broadband is not just how we expand it, right? But how we make it equitable so that everybody in the state has access to this key resource that that everyone is going to need in order to participate in our economy. And so I think that's sort of the driving force behind what we're trying to do with Connect Maine. There is right now significant federal funding coming. It's actually 3 new pots of money, right? There's the funding that was in the we call it the American Recovery Plan, specifically through Treasury for broadband, we're hoping. And then there's actually 2 other pots of money in that same line. So this is, there's one for municipalities and one for counties. And broadband is specifically mentioned in those activities. So we have a unique opportunity right now to combine our community planning process with community funding and county funding and state funding and federal funding to really make some significant changes and significant gains in how we're serving people with broadband. That's it.
Thank you, Maggie. So let's have Kendra Jo go next.
Sure. Thank you, Maggie. So I'm Kendra Jo Grindle. I work for the Island Institute as the broadband lead and a senior community development officer. And the Island Institute has been involved in broadband conversations since about 2015. Our role in this and priority in broadband came out of a series of conversations with stakeholders, mostly starting with island communities. We have 15 unbridged year-round island communities off the coast of Maine. And our work typically reflects the needs of those communities as well as remote and rural communities on the coast. So our priorities often shift every 5 or so years. Broadband has been a constant and will continue to be a priority of ours moving forward because we have not yet tackled it. We haven't even come close. So when we started to have these conversations, we were hearing not necessarily someone standing up and saying, I need access to broadband, but they were talking about how they couldn't get their credit card machines to run in the peak summer season. And it was, hurting their business. An inn on Monhegan that, was reliant on online registrations for their hotel, and their internet was not stable enough to get those in and keep them updated. So they didn't really know what was happening. And with phone service being, hit or miss sometimes, it was difficult to run their business and stay on top of it, knowing how much to staff, knowing how much food to order. There was just so many elements that kind of came along with this. Digital education opportunities for some of our smallest communities in Maine that are remote, and our outer island communities that are one-room schoolhouses and have very few students, but looking at online possibilities to connect them with other schools and bridge the gap and create kind of a bigger school experience for those students. So as we heard kind of more and more and more issues, this common thread of access to reliable high-speed internet. So even for those that had adequate speeds as defined by the FCC and the state, the reliability was still an issue, whether it was because of technology or the age of that infrastructure or just the demand that we have as users, right? We are much different users of the internet than we were 10 years ago or even a year ago at this point. And that demand just continuing to increase. And seeing that it wasn't just islands, but really the entire state of Maine that was having these issues, both in rural and urban areas for different reasons. And seeing that statewide action in policy and at the Connect Maine Authority and the Maine Broadband Coalition, those were opportunities to kind of move that needle a little bit more in a direction that would help not just islands in the coast, but all of the communities in Maine. So we started to really focus in on that. We developed, with support from many of our communities, the community-driven broadband process model, which is on our website and has been tested by several and improved by many as they go through this process and seek planning funding from the Connect Maine Authority, from the Maine Community Foundation and the Island Institute to really pull together a committee that can look at their community and start to survey and ask the questions around what access is already here, what access do we need to sustain ourselves today, and what access would we need to sustain our community in 10 years or 20 years or further than that. And starting to ask those questions early really helps guide a community to what their solution is. We had several communities over the last few years that were able to prioritize broadband and do full fiber builds. We've had even more that have been able to talk with their providers and start to fill in the smaller gaps in service for short-term solution. But even with that solution, they don't stop talking because they know that it's not the long-term solution for their community. And as we start to think about what motivates a broadband committee or even just a community to come together around this issue. In the past, I would have said it's just people who are frequent to libraries or town halls and they have inadequate service. Usually the the foundation of a broadband committee in the past would have just been people who either don't have any service or it's inadequate to what they need to do for work or for personal life. Over the last year, that has significantly changed, and we've seen a lot more mandates coming from municipal leaders, selectmen, city councilmen, that have asked for a committee to form and really prioritize this and just start to report back on what is happening in their community and where are the gaps, who's lacking service, what businesses or students or healthcare workers are kind of being left behind because the inadequate service in their community. So that shift, because of the pandemic, was a strong one. It's what's got a lot of communities planning over the last year and starting to prepare themselves for the bond funds at the state level, as well as looking towards future funding, knowing they're not ready today, but in 6 or 12 months, they would be in a much better position. And with municipal leaders really backing these committees, it helps to have that political will through the entire process. Because with any build that's going to happen, you really need that municipal leader or all of your municipal leaders around the table to be backing and prioritize this project. It's infrastructure, just like other infrastructure, but when you're going to a town meeting and asking for partial or full funding for projects and expansion, it's really important to have, not only the community, but also the municipal leaders that have been following along and learning as you go through this. It's no longer a luxury of some and a private issue of whether you have internet or not. It's really a community-wide issue, and it needs a community-wide solution.
Thank you, Kendra Jo. Judy.
I think Kendra, and on behalf of the Island Institute, is being a little bit modest in terms of what's been accomplished. I looked through the community-driven broadband process document that you've created, and it's excellent. And if any of the communities are looking for really good guidance, it's there, as well as resource links. I'm going to use some slides, so I'm going to share my screen. Host has disabled participant screen sharing, so I just need an okay. Well, I'll say okay and try again. How's that? Nope, not yet. Maggie, can you give me access?
Working on it.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I'm not controlling the Zoom.
I didn't know if you were frozen.
Judy, I've made you a co-host, so that way you should be able to.
Yep, that's it. Okay. Okay, so it's that screen and share. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit on tools to both advance broadband, but also to do so with hopefully less sprawl, which I think was the name of this this event. So here's my overview. There's some planning tools to talk about, financing options, and where I speak of equity issues, I've put it in that gold color. I don't need to read these to you. These are the areas that I'll be covering. So in terms of comprehensive planning, very simple to have a policy that says improve it. Broadband within your community. But if you're going to have an equitable statement, it's to make broadband accessible for your entire community. The implementation strategies are basically a recipe straight out of the Island Institute community-driven broadband process. You need a committee, good cross-section of people. You've got to figure out what your needs are. Are you going to do it on your own? Or are you going to work with your neighbors? If you're going to assess your needs, get one of those broadband planning grants from Peggy and hire a consultant. Then getting further into, so how do we do this? There are a variety of funding strategies. I'll talk about a few of them. Education is critical at almost every step of this process. So that's why I've got my feedback and repeat. So speaking in terms of policy tools, this building to reach all homes is going to be the most expensive option. But it's really where rural areas with very limited development pressure are at. I mean, they're just going to have to figure this out in terms of putting the investment in the infrastructure themselves and spreading that payback across all of the subscribers. The Downeast Broadband utility, which covers the city of Calais and the town of Baileyville, is a really good example of this. I'm coming to you over those airwaves right now. It took a lot of leadership at the local level to say, we're going to do this. We're going to pool our resources. We're going to take out, we're going to borrow. We're going to figure out what the subscription rate needs to be in order to pay back the initial investment in the infrastructure. And in terms of equity, it is to cover everywhere in both towns. And what they've done is the utility owns the infrastructure, and then providers compete to provide services. So you don't have to go to Spectrum or Pioneer or any number of them. All providers can give you a price across this infrastructure. So I think that is one of the now proven examples of how to do this to reach all members of your community, and to do so with that public-private approach. A variety of incentives that I think can be used that are very similar to other types of planning tools for, say, getting affordable housing, have to do with focusing your efforts within growth areas by providing density bonuses. So maybe the utility prioritizes hanging fiber in those growth areas. But if a developer proposes reduction in lot sizes, they build smaller and AKA affordable homes, they perhaps get density bonuses and maybe subsidized connectivity to those main lines. In rural areas, again, with development pressure, I don't think this really works where you don't have a lot of development pressure, but you get the developer to extend those base lines along the primary arterials, and perhaps a density bonus if they pay to extend from that trunk line to the front foot of each new lot. So I think that's just a couple of examples. There are other incentives. I've seen a lot of planners on the attendee list here, and I know all of you are thinking, like we could also do, other types of incentives that have been used in many cases for affordable housing. Money tools, I want to focus on tax increment financing in particular. So these districts are usually set up within the development areas in downtowns or on specific large developments in order to pay for, picket, sidewalks, street lamps, parking areas, even additions to your sewage treatment plant. Will broaden it. Consider using TIFs to pay for that broadband assessment if you can't get a grant from Peggy, to get the technical analyses done, and to build the core infrastructure. One thing I learned with this Downeast broadband utility is it's not just laying lines. They've got a downscale from the 3-ring binder. There's switching stations, and that's as far into the black box as I'm going to go, but there's some basic infrastructure that's core that needs to be paid for. Use a TIF to pay for that. Build a tower where you've got that downscaling off the 3-ring binder, and so that it can then reach out to rural areas before, say, fiber gets out to rural areas. Build that web presence for education. Some people still really don't get the value of having broadband. The whole issue of using it, well, I guess we get it a whole lot more now after the pandemic than we ever used to. But the telemedicine opportunities and access for children who are literally stuck at home. And then using TIFs to build that last mile infrastructure so that you can basically have the entire community help fund the infrastructure that gets out to the people that are, say, in a mobile home park outside on the fringe of the growth area, or maybe there's a whole bunch of modest homes down, you know, a particular road where you know you've got some low income issues. Start there. And then I think I've already spoken about municipal bonding and a municipal utility. This is what the Downeast Broadband utility has done. They own the fiber, that providers compete, and the borrowing is backed by the Municipal Taxation Authority. Downeast Broadband utility is not the only example. Google and find and talk to people in Roque Bluffs. They've done very similar things themselves. And whoops, back up. One thing I really want to stress is that sound land use planning still applies. I don't know if anyone of you watched Channel 2 News, but last night, Don Kerrigan had a really interesting spot. I think it was called Pandemic Haven Turns to Permanent Home. And where a couple who brought their employment with them and their kids, they had moved here during the pandemic and were renting and said, this is nice, and decided to stay. They've purchased a home. And the things that they talked about in this segment were, it's walkable, it's safe, we get to, the school's good, we have access to amenities. Maine is really nice. So I think we really need to remember that we need broadband, yes, but there are things about Maine that are attracting people. It was another thing on the news last night. Real estate prices in 4 counties are up over 40% since December, just in the last 3 months. I don't know if it was prices or turnover, but I think it was prices. So this phenomenon is not going away. We saw it in the LUPC district service area last year. Our permits are up 38% over last year, and they're still rising. The activity level, the inquiries during the winter, which is supposed to be our slow time, are high to medium to high in every single regional office. So we can definitely keep the sound land use planning tools that we've got while we attract more people, or rather while we provide broadband. And so we continue to support what makes people want to move here. So I guess I would just conclude that the factors for success absolutely is local leadership. The Downeast Broadband utility would never have happened if it weren't for the people within on these boards locally who said, the private sector is not going to do this for us. Down in Roque Bluffs too, private sector was not going to do it. They decided, let's figure this out. Let's find the models. Let's work with the Island Institute and educate and find out what people need. Then figure out innovative financing. There's a bunch of tools, but still remember what makes you unique and attractive. And that's all I've got. Let's stop sharing. Did I stop?
And I think we've got about, for the next 15 minutes or so, I want to kind of continue the conversation amongst ourselves. I have some questions that I came up with. And I just wanted to provide a reminder to the audience. Feel free to pop any questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end of the program. So my first question is, why is community engagement important, and why are community planning organizations important to moving this work forward? Kendra, Jo, would you like to start with that?
Sure. I think we've hit on this a little bit, but community engagement, in the long run really looks like a return on investment. So from the very beginning, the more engaged your community is, the faster you can move through this process, from talking with providers to moving forward on surveying work, getting planning dollars. I mean, as a grantor of planning funds, I know Connect Maine, Island Institute, Maine Community Foundation, we look for community engagement when you're seeking grant dollars. Honestly, whether that's planning or infrastructure at a state or federal level, they're looking for community engagement. They want to know that when you put this service in place, whether it's fiber or fixed wireless, or pick your technology, pick your provider, they want to know that someone is going to be there taking service and it'll be utilized. So community engagement from the very beginning is really critical. Then if you're getting to a town meeting where you're voting on funding, partial or full, or even just an act to apply for a grant, you're going to be looking to your neighbors to vote yes on that. Again, the stronger turnout that we have seen has been because people were engaged and informed from the beginning. They were invited to provider conversations. They were updated through whatever communication streams are available in a community, newsletters, Facebook, just an informal information session. We've definitely seen progress happen more quickly after a single community information session because people at least feel like their questions were answered or their voice was heard, and they were able to contribute their story or their thoughts to this process. And the last part is they're going to be the subscribers. Your community members are the ones that are going to take service. This is particularly critical if you are looking at some form of municipally owned build, right? They are the providers that are going to be paying for this subscription service that you'll see that return on investment over the life of your funding, whether that's 15 or 20 years. So the more community members that you have on your service, the better payback that you'll see in the long run. And I think for community planning organizations, Lincoln County Regional Planning is an incredible partner of ours in Lincoln County. They were able to support 7 towns through a Connect Maine planning grant, phase 1 and 2. And even for the towns that weren't included in that grant, Mary Ellen Barnes and her staff there were able to keep track and keep providing information and supporting those communities in other ways. I just connected with her this week, and we just run through our list, and having her capacity, it's similar to ours, but she knows the full economics of your community. She can start to weigh the checks and balances of what's happening, across your entire community infrastructure wise, and having that support and capacity. We look to a lot of planning commissions and just economic commissions in the state that can help provide that on the ground capacity. My team doesn't know every town in the state. Even in our coastal communities, we aren't fully aware of the entire community at times. So it helps to have someone that's just a little closer to that town, to the municipal leaders, to the community leaders, and can really support and provide access to the networks and resources that are available.
Yeah, I want to chime in on the importance of the county activity. The plans that we have seen moving forward really do have a county leadership to them, or they're covering multiple towns. And I think the important word that we're doing here is we're building networks, and scale really matters, right? So if you're a small town and you haven't engaged your neighbors, I say this a lot in the legislature, which is you have to go through the willies to get to the wags. So you have to work with your neighbors. You're building a network, and scale matters for cost in this. So Franklin County has done a phenomenal job. We gave them a planning grant in 2018, and we followed up with a couple since then. And they have broken their county up into essentially 5 regions and are working on those regions with different plans. So there's different strategies depending on what region you're in and the connectivity there and what the communities are interested in. But that is a way that gives them sort of both sizable chunks, that gives them some scale that they can work on. But it has been that kind of leadership, right? The kind of leadership that the county can provide that's created those opportunities for multiple communities to have a conversation. We cannot build this one town at a time because it's too expensive. And because, again, we're building a network. And so it's important for people to work with their neighbors on this project. That's a really important piece, and engaging your community planning agency as well as your town planners is a really critical piece of how this all can work.
Awesome. Judy, do you want to add anything, or should we keep going? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about equity. What does equity mean in regards to access to broadband? Peggy, do you want to start on this one?
Yeah, I mean, at its basic core, broadband is the economic tool of this century, right? It's the economic tool that brings the communication to your household. So if you're going to raise all boats in your community, if you're going to give everybody in your community the chance to participate in civic life, in social life, in education, in healthcare, that means they have to have access to broadband. And so that has multiple components to it, right? It isn't just a wire running by your door. It is also the ability to afford the service that comes with that. It's the ability to have a device, right? You need a device to get online, and an understanding of how to use that device, how to be safe on the internet, how to use the different applications that come on a device that you can actually access the internet with. So those are really the four components of how we, what we think of in terms of digital inclusion is what the term is. And libraries have taken a big lead on this because they've been a community spot that have pretty good quality broadband that anybody can come in, and librarians have really essentially shifted their role from being the books person to being the internet person for many communities. And so for us, when you're thinking, this is again goes back to the importance of a plan, right? When you're thinking about how you're going to bring service to your community, it is really important to think about a consideration around cost and how people are going to access that piece. So the whole community conversation really is a conversation about digital literacy, right? Why do we need this? Who's going to use it? All of the various components, but making sure people have access to that is really critical. And one really great example of that is the town of Islesboro, which not only decided to build their own network. They don't run it. They have an internet service provider they contract with who runs it. But the town decided to do the billing. So they build in a piece of the operational cost into the property tax along with the capital expense. And the result of that is they're able to provide everybody on the island with a gig service that's a gigabyte up and down for about $30 a month. That is a really important piece for that. That was a really important piece for that community. And that decision drove some of the discussion about how we're going to build and what we're going to build. So I think it's really important to have, as you're having a conversation about how are we going to bring service to everybody, you make sure it is everybody, right? Understand the importance of making sure everybody in your community can afford to get connected.
Okay, so what about sprawl? And Judy, I know you started touching on this in your presentation, but what is the connection between broadband and sprawl and economic development? Is there a connection? Do you think broadband's driving sprawl? Is it really not connected?
Well, I don't know that I would assume categorically that broadband is driving sprawl. I think the choices that some businesses make to locate, the ubiquitous Dollar General dollar stores that we see in rural Maine. The choices that large companies like that make to locate have to do with multiple factors besides broadband. Broadband may be one of them, but they have the resources, some of the larger actors, to pay for connectivity that, say, individual residences couldn't afford to pay for. So they're going to make their decisions based on so many other factors that I think I go back to get your planning and regulations house in order in terms of promoting where you want to see development occur, almost regardless of broadband. And remember that developing in the core, in the village, in the city center is creating an environment that the market demonstrably wants to be in and wants to enjoy. So I know that some people disagree with me on this one, but I think sprawl has so many other influences that I don't see broadband being the tipping point that's going to, mess up your town. I think you'd be far better off really focusing on improving your broadband and focusing on multiple planning tools that will maintain nice village centers and dense neighborhoods that people are enjoying and seeking after.
You know, sometimes people live on the outskirts of town for a whole variety of reasons, right? It's a generational home that they inherited from their parents. It's the cheapest place where you can get land. All of those kinds of things, why people sort of live out of the center. I am not sure that broadband design drives any of those decisions. If you're gonna make a decision to move out of this town, broadband could be a deciding factor, but chances are, you know, right now in this era we're living in now, where housing is so under demand, these are already houses that are built, right? So this, people aren't building new, people are buying what's existing, and they're looking for a connectivity for them to be able to participate both in the education piece and all those pieces that broadband is enabling. So I keep, when I come back to this conversation, I keep coming back. You know, one of the problems that we have in the legislature, quite frankly, and actually in Congress too, is that people who are making decisions about who should have and who should not have broadband and what kind of funding we should give to broadband are usually made by people who have a connection and don't understand what it's like not to have a connection. And so I think it's really important. That's why I keep coming back to this equity piece and how important this is as a tool for individuals in this economy, right? This isn't about your necessarily the economic growth of your community in the large sense. This is really about how to create a community where people can be equitable and can have the same access to all of the opportunities this particular utility can provide. And so I keep coming back to that for that very reason. This is really about how we create equity in this economy and how we can make sure everyone has an opportunity to have access to the same tools that people with resources can have access to.
Particularly right now, just basic education. Telemedicine for sure, but basic education for some of these kids that live, you know, multiple miles away from the school.
And I would just add to Peggy's last point that that's part of the reason why these conversations and progress was so slow up until the pandemic, was because for what we really saw on select boards and those that were attending a lot of, you know, town meetings or select board meetings, were people that already had access to something that was adequate for their life or for their professional work. And it wasn't until the pandemic when we saw high saturation rates, people home all the time doing Zoom meetings and realizing that the service that they thought was adequate for themselves really wasn't all the time, right? We saw inconveniences across whole streets, whole communities, even when you had what the FCC or Connect Maine defines as, you know, broadband level service. We now know that, you know, a lot of us knew before, but a lot more people realize now that that speed isn't necessarily adequate, nor the reliability of that service for the sustainability of remote work or telemedicine or online education. And so that's one thing over the past year and a half. It's made it so that the whole community is really starting to feel what it feels like to not have the level of service that you need, to have to go to your library or go to some other public access point to start to get the connectivity that you need to just sustain your day-to-day. And, you know, I talked to community members that during this time have had to utilize their cellular service, have had to utilize a satellite service or another provider, and just switching between multiple providers to get the level of service that they need. That's not affordable, first off, when you're balancing more than one provider. And second, it's just not something that people should have to do.
Thank you. And I want to make sure we leave time for audience questions. So one last question is, and you've all kind of touched on this, but what's one takeaway in terms of what Mainers can be doing now?
So I just got to say, I don't want to, there is more money in the next 6 months coming towards broadband or the potential for broadband than there has been in the last 10 years combined and times 4, right? I mean, it just, and so having these conversations in your community, making sure to include your selectmen, because there's a chunk of money coming to each community. one of the opportunities for that money is, it's all one-time money, is broadband, as well as funding for counties, right? So one of the opportunities for all that is money, is broadband. So it's important, I think, when we do this to really start these conversations now and get ready. Most of these funds, because they're COVID relief funds, have a limited time period that they have to be used in. And so I think this is a significant opportunity to begin to have these deep conversations in your community and to move them at a fairly fast pace, because there is a time frame happening here. And so over the next 5 to 6 months, it's going to be really important to begin to think about, to really have conversations about what are we going to do in our community, right? Do we want to own our own network? Do we want to have a provider come in and own the network? Do we want a partnership around that? But there's significant help to help online around this kind of stuff, right? I hate to say that, but on our webpage, we have Next Century Cities has a great handbook. The Institute for Self-Reliance has a great broadband community stuff. The Island Institute does. All of the community broadband plans that have been worked on across the state are on our website. So just really get out there and really begin to have these conversations and figure out how to make sure that you can bring this service to your community. The piece that we haven't really talked about is the futureness of this, right? So this is infrastructure is going to last for 20 years. So when we build it, we had better make sure it's going to meet our demands for 20 years. And 20 years ago, everybody was happy with 256K, right? And now we're talking a gig. So it's really important as you have these conversations in your community to have the conversation about what is our community, what our demands are going to be in 10 and 15 years, and build that infrastructure that's going to get you there.
Peggy nailed it. Start talking, start getting involved with your community, start listening. And if your community has a survey, respond to it. Take the Maine Broadband Coalition speed test so that you can start, filling in and putting your data on that statewide map. If you're a planner, check in with your communities and ask, what are they doing for broadband? Connect them to the resources that are available in the state. Connect Maine Authority, Island Institute, Maine Broadband Coalition, GrowSmart. There's a lot of really strong broadband leaders with resources, some funding, and it's just helpful to know what's going on out there. And these are, for a lot of communities, they're small, they have limited capacity, and so sometimes they just need that extra push, right? That's where a lot of our work at the Island Institute, our partners in Maine West, where we kind of step in is helping to just facilitate them through a process, helping to make sure that they're staying on track and staying focused, especially during a time like now where there's so much money. We're just hearing about all of this money. We don't necessarily know exactly how it's going to be deployed, and there's a lot of uncertainties with it, but we do know that it's earmarked for broadband, and we know that it's coming. And I have communities that were right on the path, and then they heard money, and they panicked. And the best we can do is say, stay focused, stay on the path, and maybe just pick it up a little bit. Have another community information session, keep your community informed, check in with your select board. I mean, political will is super key to so many of these conversations, and not having the political will in your community can really be a barrier once you get, far enough along. So I would just have the conversations.
Somebody raised the typical question we get these days about Starlink. First off, I will say that Starlink, this should be a garden where all flowers can grow, right? So that's a piece. There are lots of places in the state where Starlink is going to be potentially the long-term solution. It is in beta testing, right? This is a company that hasn't made any money yet. This is not a commercially available product yet. They are picking who can get Starlink and who cannot. And they are trying to figure out how this service is going to work as they roll out and get more people on it. So it's never going to be, I don't think, ever equivalent to what you can get with fiber, especially in terms of upspeed, right? Downspeed is about consumerism, upspeed is about creationism. So we really care about creation. We really care about Mainers having a voice, which is the upspeed. And so right now, mostly Starlink it's in its beta stage. The piece that worries me about Starlink is that you're not building out a network. You're providing service to individuals. It's $100 a month, which is not affordable. And so while people in your community can probably get access to Starlink as it becomes commercially available, there are people in your community who won't be able to. My concern is that we are 10 years from now having the same conversation about bringing fiber to people's houses because people who could afford Starlink got it and the rest of the people in the community didn't get anything. And so I think it's really important that Starlink stay as an option, especially for we all know there are parts of the state where we're never bringing fiber to, and Starlink is a great option for that. But for places where we can bring fiber and where your neighbors need the same connection you do, it's important that we focus on this as a community resource.
Thanks, Peggy. So we had one question. How did you conduct community engagement during the pandemic where large groups could not gather and not all residents had access to online meetings?
I just want to say we ran a broadband boot camp in the Western Mountains during the pandemic. We had planned all these meetings. We were going to go to the islands. We're going to do a whole bunch of stuff. We had meetings, I think, every other week. They were an hour and a half to 2 hours. We had 50 and 60 community members come to every meeting. We would not have had that had we had in-person meetings. So I actually think that the pandemic has enabled a lot more conversations around this than it would have otherwise. Our Connect Maine meetings, we used to have 6 people at them. We called them lovingly the usual suspects who would come to our meetings, right? We now have 60 and 70 people who attend our meetings. So I think one of the things that broadband enables is this community access, this civic engagement that's really important. And I think that actually has helped. The pandemic has helped that process.
I'd like to underscore that as well. I've heard it that's been the case in municipalities around here, and here being Washington County, but also we've all gotten pretty good at these platforms. And there's a bill, I think it's LD 32 in front of the legislature right now, that will actually allow public hearings and public meetings to be held virtually going forward. Because right now, I believe we can hold all of these various meetings, for instance, the Land Use Planning Commission, under the auspices of the state of civil emergency that was declared over a year ago. So I'm actually really trying to support, either by policy or if necessary by legislation, our ability to hold these meetings virtually, say from December to February, where we would post on the website 24 hours in advance. In the event of inclement weather, we will go to virtual. Here's how you do that. And people know how to do it. And I'll speak just one more point on that. For those who don't have internet, we had to solve the issue of you can phone in to these meetings, and people have used it, and they've used it both because, oh, my internet's not great this time, or I'm echoing, so I'll call in and link my call in to my video, or I just call in. So it's going to virtual. Not only do I think it has improved participation, I think it could continue to do so once the world rights itself. Let's hope that happens sometime, and that it still does allow participation by telephone into these virtual meetings for those who don't have internet yet.
Yeah, and I think that's been a pretty critical piece in a lot of community meetings and conversations that we've had. For a lot of broadband committees, they've been able to, open up their regular session. They would typically bring a provider in or providers in to have a conversation, or partners like Peggy, myself, Judy, and some others, and that would be just with the committee. But now they can just share the link and it's public and people can call in. And I think just making everyone aware of that, I think by now there's a lot more people aware of it. But in the beginning, it was online. They didn't know how to do it. They couldn't attend. And we weren't talking about how you could phone in. So that getting over that hurdle was pretty beneficial. And for a lot of communities, people are still reading the paper. We're utilizing that. They are utilizing, other communication streams in their community, sending out one-pagers, whether it's in a local newsletter or in a simple mailing, just so that people have the information and can stay informed. The last thing that's been good about Zoom and some of these other online platforms is exactly what's happening now. This is being recorded. Someone couldn't make it from 4 to 5 o'clock, but they can watch it later, or they could watch it this weekend if they wanted to. I'm sure a lot of people do. That's a benefit that you don't have when it's a public meeting, and if you miss it, you miss it. In the community of Vinyl Haven, their select board meetings and their public meetings are hosted on Zoom, recorded, linked to Facebook Live. And someone made a comment that there's no longer the excuse of, well, I have to make dinner, or I can't because I'm in transit. You can just call in, you can listen, or you could watch it later. And so there really has been a lot more engagement and just that sharing of information.
Hey, Maggie.
Mm-hmm.
You had asked, what's the one thing? And so I'm going to say two things. One is, don't reinvent the wheel. There are so many examples out there that Peggy and Kendra Jo mentioned. But the other is, and someone pointed this out, Bill Welsh from Civic in the chat, that some rural leaders resist or are poorly informed about technology. And I totally agree with that. And that if you are getting involved, showing leadership, and et cetera, as we've been recommending, be ready with why it's important for you, for your neighbor, for your business, for your kids at school, for your grandmother, for telemedicine. Just be ready and just hammer those points, because and make them relevant to the cross section of your community. Because it is still very true. I don't need that. I still got a flip phone. That still exists. My husband still has a flip phone. Drives me crazy, but that is the case, and we still have to get past that.
Yeah, people shouldn't be held back because of others' recalcitrance to adopt new technology. It's not good for the community when two people in town say, I have a flip phone, that's all you need. I mean, it's sort of like, there's often you hear from providers who don't have the resources to expand their neighborhood, expand their footprint, that, the service I provide is all these community needs. And I often liken that to you going to the grocery store and saying, I'd like a steak, in the grocery store saying, all we have is hamburger and that's all you need, right? That's not how this works, right? This is really about what the community wants, what customers want, not what's available necessarily. There's a couple questions about sort of what resources to Connect Me needs and how to engage in this. We really encourage community partnerships between multiple communities, and internet service providers. There are other parts of this country where the community, larger communities usually take on the role of internet service provider. We have not seen that in Maine. So it's an area of expertise that you can contract out. The Downeast Broadband did this. They hired an ISP to build their network. They hired an ISP to maintain the network. They hired an ISP to run the network. So this can all be done. The infrastructure is still owned by the community, but the service being provided is by a service provider who can bring you the internet. So that is a really great model. If you want to own the infrastructure, you have a professional ISP come in and operate it for you. Right now, Connect Me has always needed funding, right? Because we've been bumping along at about 1.5 million a year. Right now, it looks like the spigots are open, and quite frankly, what we need is bodies, right? We need people engaged in this work to really begin to do this. There's two of us at Connect Me. We cannot bring broadband to every community across the country, across the state. That has to be you, right? That has to be people in the community doing this engaging work. And so that's really the work that needs to happen now. There is federal money coming. There's probably state money coming, but it's the communities who really have to do this groundwork. Broadband is a street by street battle. And it's really important that communities are engaged in that, because the state's not going to tell you what to do. We're going to provide you resources. We're going to try to help you figure it out. And there are other partners involved, the Broadband Coalition, the Island Institute. There are lots of people who can help you with this, but you have to pick up the ball and run.
Maggie, Nancy has asked if I could address this one question from Paul Toll in Aroostook County.
Yeah, sure.
Can everyone see these Q&As? I don't need to read this, do I?
I can read it. I'm not sure if attendees can or not. I'll summarize. So Paul lives, the person asking the question lives in Aroostook, and he said for Aroostook County, Sprawl preceded Broadband by about 150 years because of the nature of their agriculture and forest industries, similar to a lot of rural Maine. There's people who live in their homes because they're old family homes or working farms, and they've been there forever, and there really aren't other affordable options. So he asked, he said client densities and take rates are a challenge in including all of their broadband build outs. And he said, how can affordable, digitally inclusive strategies be employed in these scenarios?
So the answer here is not really simple, but it is very similar to the strategy taken with the Downeast broadband utility and with Roque Bluffs, where they decided on a community-wide basis here in collaboration with neighbors. Roque Bluffs, I think, went it alone and did an assessment of what the number of potential customers would be, what the distances are, and how much it would cost to lay that fiber. And they created a public entity that could borrow against municipal taxation authority in order to build the fiber infrastructure and then pay back the loan that it took to build that on the basis of the take rates and the property tax that they collect every year. So, and I believe Cranberry Isles was a similar model, was it not? So
Yeah, I mean,
there are examples, and they are in very rural areas. So, it may be that the numbers in, I think you said in Cranberry Isles, it was, or I forget the example you used, Kendra, but it was $30 on the property tax every year, an additional $30. Is that sufficient? Or rather, maybe it was every month. I can't remember the numbers, but run the numbers to determine what is acceptable. And then you probably have to get voter approval for that bond based on, very clear-eyed laying out what the numbers will be and what the costs will be. I think I may have mangled the numbers here a bit, so go ahead and
yeah.
add to this.
I mean, I think in our most rural communities, and even when they're not, even when they don't have a history of borrowing large sums of money, I mean, for some of these communities, it's been half or more of their typical town budget, or definitely more than their school budget. I mean, these are, when you're doing a universal 100% fiber to the home build, it's a lot of money. It's a large sum of money when you look at that one number. But when you look at that number across 20 years, whatever that number is that you're borrowing against, or you look at it across a take rate, none of our communities have said we're going to get 100% take rate. Every single person in our community is going to subscribe to this. No one has ever started out with saying that, because it's completely unrealistic, right? So you're starting out thinking 40% of the town, maybe 50, maybe you could go to 60. And you start to work with those numbers, and you'll see that multi-million-dollar number come down to a month-to-month on a tax base plus the subscriber fee number. And it's honestly pretty similar. I have a couple of resources from both Vinyl Haven and Islesboro that I can share, but it's pretty adequate to what you're seeing from a typical provider like Spectrum or Consolidated when you get to that month-to-month over that lifespan of the bond. The other piece is that in some of these rural communities, for the solution that people want, and this is kind of going back to Peggy earlier, for the solution that people want that will outlive the cost of the build, that will outlive themselves, even you're looking at, a large build, but you're also looking at a build that is going to need community investment, provider partnership, and either state or federal investment. So this is a creative capital stack that you're going to need both the community involved in, the provider involved in, and the state. And that's why it's really important for the Connect Maine Authority to have more money than we've seen them have in the past, because only having $500,000 or $700,000 doesn't go far, but having millions of dollars you can stretch, I mean, even the $15 million, we'll be able to see that stretch across Maine and really kick up some really strong projects and some strong collaborations over these 2 rounds of funding. So it's not just the town going it alone. It's really a partnership between the provider, the town, private donation if that's possible, and state funding. And that's what's going to bring it into, especially into those rural areas where you haven't seen the premise density to bring a provider. And we always say, if a provider was going to come to you, they would have already done it. If there was the profit to be made, they would be there. And so where they're not, they may get there in 5 years or 10 years, or maybe a different technology will come a little sooner. But is it the right technology for what your needs are? Is it the right time frame for the community's needs? If it's not, then it's time to start talking about how the community can begin a process that brings their voice to the table and brings a solution to them, instead of what we've always seen, which is providers bring the solution they want and they have to you, and that's it. The last point I'll make, Starlink, wireless, telecom providers, it's okay to have multiple solutions. We've just grown accustomed to, we have one thing and it's good enough. It's okay to have multiple solutions. In other countries, they have multiple solutions. And I don't know why we've gotten so comfortable with, we have one thing and that's enough for us. We should have an opportunity to create the market pressure that we want to create as consumers, and really start to see the demand that we need to see, because we have a voice in it. And that's what we've seen with communities, even if they're partnering with their incumbent provider. But getting their voice at the table, putting in a little bit of money, goes a long way when it comes to really getting the solution that you need.
Thank you all so much. And thank you so much to everyone who attended today. I think we're going to wrap it up here, but we're going to keep having these discussions. It's really important and a goal for GrowSmart Maine to keep talking about how we can promote broadband access, but also balance that with wanting to help promote our traditional industries and not invade our farmlands, and get people to live in downtown. So we're going to keep talking about this, and we will send a follow-up email around that has our 3 panelists' contact information, as well as the resources that we were popping in the chat. But thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.